Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you for coming this morning for what promises to be a timely and very interesting conversation on energy in the Americas. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas, and it really gives me pleasure to welcome you to the first meeting that we're hosting under a renewed partnership on energy between my combined organizations and also the Inter-American Development Bank under the leadership of President Luis Alberto Moreno. And from the energy side, Leandro Alves, who has made a meaningful and indeed lasting contribution in the Americas as the head of the IDB Energy Program. He and his team, including Ramon Espinosa and others, have a deep understanding of hemispheric energy realities and opportunities, and we're working together to define and promote a path forward on hemispheric energy, a path that is consistent with public values and market-led solutions that build energy security, support economic growth, promote universal access, encourage both conservation and new approaches, and position energy as a means for increased hemispheric cooperation. The program this morning is a key to this effort, and we're delighted to have attracted such a fine group of speakers and knowledgeable audience members, all of you, for our discussion. In my view, energy is the story in the Americas today. Truthfully, most observers have missed it, or at least not given the issues the prominence that they deserve. Energy is remaking the hemisphere, and in my view, cooperation is the key. Economically, energy affects every one of us as we conduct our daily activities. At the macro level, it's a major component of national competitiveness, terms of trade and investment decisions. It's also a sector that is directly and significantly impacted by respective national investment climates, both real and perceived, and by perceptions of either the improvement or the deterioration of investment climates. Politically, the story about energy is even more interesting. As it does everywhere around the world, an abundance of energy at sufficiently high prices can enable leaders to institute sometimes unorthodox development strategies while reducing pressure sometimes for political reforms. And it can be sensitive from the commitment of the new president of Mexico to liberalize energy investment and to reform Pemex, to the Brazilian and other governments' efforts to temper open foreign investment with increasingly nationalistic approaches, or decisions on cross-border energy integration, including the Keystone XL pipeline. These are controversial issues, and domestic audiences are looking to find paths forward on each of them. Environmentally, Latin America enjoys the world's cleanest energy matrix, with a large percentage of hydro and other renewables in use across the region, including ethanol and nuclear. With much of South America part of the Amazon basin, Latin America has a large role to play as well in global climate change mitigation discussions. And everyone will feel the heat of a warming climate, while the island states of the Caribbean and all coastal areas will see the negative impact of rising sea levels. And we probably will hear a little bit about that today from the ambassador of Trinidad. Technologically, energy will continue to be a primary driver of research, development, and innovation in the region. It has created entire new industries in which the Western Hemisphere is a global leader, including deep water drilling, fracking, biofuels and clean energy, flex fuel autos, battery storage, and others, just to name a few. Strategically, an energy-secure Western Hemisphere would, by definition, rely less on energy imports from more volatile regions of the world, notably the Middle East. This has huge implications for global security, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, the unrelenting quest by China to lock in access to energy has become a global issue, including Chinese efforts in the Western Hemisphere, which have begun to attract the attention of security and development experts alike. So there's ample room here for a robust energy dialogue on the Americas with a look ahead to the trends and emerging issues that face the region, and that is precisely what we aim to do this morning. And to get us started, we think we have the best person that could be imagined. We're delighted that Rob Mosbacher is here to offer some initial remarks. As all of you know, Rob is the chairman of the Mosbacher Energy Company, an independent oil and gas exploration and production company based in Houston. From 1986 to 2005, he was the president and CEO of the company, when he left to become the president and CEO of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation here in Washington. He has been extremely active in the Houston and Washington and other communities, serving as board chair of the Greater Houston Partnership, for example, in 2004, and holding numerous other leadership positions in and around Houston. Rob is currently on several for-profit and nonprofit boards, including, it must be said, the Americas Society, and he has just agreed to co-chair our Energy Action Group. I can think of no one better suited to begin our conversations this morning. It's a real pleasure to welcome to the podium, ladies and gentlemen, Rob Mosbacher.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate that. Eric, thank you very much, and very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm delighted to be here with you. Among the my for-profit engagements, one that Eric didn't mention, or actually a couple, are two public company boards that I serve on. One is a company called Devon Energy, large independent company located in Oklahoma City, but one of the most aggressive and committed shale play participants around. In fact, we acquired Mitchell Energy back in the early part of the last decade, and I was on the board at the time. I've known George Mitchell, who really pioneered hydraulic fracturing, known him all my life. He is, like so many, including my father, who started our business in the late 40s, a real entrepreneur, wildcatter, kind of larger-than-life oil industry type. And, but for George's stubbornness, and he's a hard-headed man, we would not be where we are in terms of having pioneered hydraulic fracturing. He spent time and resources. He had some university and U.S. government support, but frankly, it was his perseverance which ultimately proved that we could produce significant commercial quantities of particularly gas from shale. And so Devon, even when we acquired Mitchell Energy in the early part of the last decade, we knew the Barnett Shale, which was his primary area, which is about 14 counties around Fort Worth, Texas, had potential, but we never estimated that it had the kind of potential, nor did the whole technology have the potential that we've come to realize. The other board is a company called Calpine, which has about 29,000 megawatts of electrical generation across the United States, and about 98% of that is gas and gas-fired. So it's an interesting position to be in, to be both on the production side, in terms of my own family's company, and then Devon, and then on the consumption side. I think actually Calpine is the largest single consumer of natural gas in North America. So they stay very close to the question of prices and markets and availability. So as Eric said, I agree with him. I think the story in the Americas is energy. Dan Yergin, who many of you know and who lives around here and who's been a prolific writer in his current book, The Quest, suggests that the axis of influence and production is steadily shifting from the Persian Gulf to the Americas. And that's due to several factors. And of course, hydraulic fracturing and technology are the ones that get most of the credit, but I might add, good technology doesn't work in a bad economic environment. And so if you have low crude oil prices, you will not find the level of development that you'd like. So higher crude oil prices clearly have to have been an important part as it relates to the oil side of shale development, of some new plays becoming economically viable. But in terms of the technological advances, hydraulic fracturing is one. A second one that is not as often talked about, and particularly among sort of non-technical audiences, is the seismic capability that has been improved significantly. And seismic is sort of what the technology we use to take pictures, if you will, of the subsurface and to evaluate where there may be hydrocarbon accumulation. What's changed about seismic is not just that it's gone from being a two-dimensional picture to a three-dimensional picture. That happened a while ago. But the capacity to model what is below the surface. And the most recent improvement that really has paid, and I think will pay great dividends, is on the processing side. In other words, you shoot seismic, it's called, shooting it, but then you process it. And this gets into algorithms and high mathematics that way over my head. But the processing capacity of our seismic capability has improved to the point where now, for instance, the very deep pre-salt hydrocarbon accumulations off the coast of Brazil can be identified with much greater clarity than was the case, which tells you where you want to try to drill wells. So that's another improvement. And third is our ability to drill and complete wells at greater depths, 25, 30,000 feet, not to mention to drill down several thousand feet and drill horizontally several thousand feet. So all that has added up to creating a whole new day as it relates to resource availability. So let me try to do a quick geographical survey, if you will, of resources that now represent game changers and give context to Jürgen's assertion that the axis of production and influence may be shifting towards the Americas. Let's take Canada. The oil sands in Canada, which are in Alberta province, represent, depending upon who you ask, somewhere in the neighborhood of 175 billion barrels. It's a technology which is evolving. Those sort of barrels that are within a couple hundred feet of the surface are surface mined. That's visually distressing, and from an environmental impact standpoint, it's a challenge. But that's less than 10% of the production, and I think the mining side of it will get progressively better, or it will stop being done. The other 90+% of it is called in situ. So that has very limited footprint in terms of the surface and the environmental impact in terms of the surface. So you have this huge resource in Canada and a reasonably conducive economic climate, although there's always a question of resource allocation and dollar allocation, and the question of how open the Canadians are to investment from overseas, particularly the Chinese. The U.S., I mean, you all have heard all about what's going on in this country. We're absolutely flush in natural gas, but perhaps more importantly, in terms of oil production, are some of the new shale plays, specifically the Bakken in North Dakota, the Eagle Ford shale play in Texas, both of which have turned what was a declining level of production into an inclining level of production and have put the United States on a path to exceed its highest levels of production ever. And the natural gas impact should not be underestimated in the United States, particularly from the standpoint of economic impact across a variety of sectors. We're seeing lots of new investment, particularly among manufacturing, petrochemical, that's driven by low feedstock prices. I saw some hint that there may be a green light to enable the export of some of this abundant natural gas. I'd say minimum 3 years away, with the exception maybe of one plant or one facility. But the prospect of exporting natural gas, I think, represents a great opportunity for the United States and for producers. Mexico. Mexico is challenged in terms of their comfort level in engaging private sector participation, much less enabling private sector ownership. Whether or not the new incoming president, Peña Nieto, can change that. He certainly has made representations to the effect that he wants to try, and that's encouraging because Mexico has a lot more oil and gas to be produced. I'd say probably more gas, some of it deep Gulf of Mexico. Some of it may be on the same sort of resource plays in South Texas that extend across the border. So significant opportunity there. We have a representative here from Trinidad who I'm sure is going to talk in clear detail about the opportunities that Trinidad has, and again, on the gas side. Colombia. Colombia is a country that if they're not at 1 million barrels a day of production, they will be shortly. And I'd say from an industry standpoint, they have the most receptive, kind of investment-friendly legal contract framework, and they're benefiting from that. And in fact, they've benefited as well from the disarray in Venezuela, which has driven some of the most qualified professionals who used to work in PDVSA into the Colombian oil sector. And I have high hopes for Colombia to continue to add to their production. Venezuela still has plenty of resources, and if they can begin to deal with some of the political challenges differently, they can reassert themselves as a major player. They have oil sands, they have capacity that could play a role over the next 15, 20 years for sure. Argentina, another country that's blessed with great resources, but at the moment is cursed with bad political environment. I ran into somebody the other day that talked about a 1,500-foot thick section in the Vaca Muerta, which is part of the Neuquén Basin. 1,500 feet of pay, as we would call it in our business, is huge. I'm thrilled with 10 feet of pay. 1,500 feet is a lot, but they may have that kind of capability in Argentina, but they're going to have to kind of refocus the business-government relationship on a more positive vein if they're going to have the sort of investment it's going to take advantage of that. Brazil, I mentioned the pre-salt discoveries. There are multiple prospects. These have been identified through, again, the higher resolution process seismic, and multiple prospects and multiple probably billions of barrels. But again, offshore and going to be challenging. Uruguay, I read recently, it's leasing in deep water, and hoping that there's opportunity there that may carry over from what has been found in Brazil. So, and I didn't mention, in addition to the Neuquén onshore, there's offshore gas, Southern Cone gas, which has been out there for a while. Again, it's just a matter of economics and market demand. Let me touch on a few of the challenges. All these plays are expensive, and they all have long lead times, or at least most of them do, before you can bring the resource to market. And not everybody has that kind of money, and particularly governments that are constrained. So having a hostile political environment not only sends a signal to investors that their investments may not be that sound and may be at risk, but it also hamstrings the government's ability to take full advantage of the resources they have. These are extraordinarily expensive plays to develop fully. You have to have patience, and by patience I mean in the sense of recognizing that between the discovery and the announcement of something significant, which countries I've noted over the last 30 years of my career love to do, is race out and talk about this newfound wealth, don't often realize how long it's going to take before they're ever going to see it, if in fact they're going to see it. And so the expense and the long lead times are one of the challenges. Second, of course, I've already touched on the political and legal and regulatory environment for investment. Again, I'd hold Colombia up in terms of South American country as a country that is doing it right and would be a great model. I hope Mexico can get it right, and I hope that the Brazilians will continue to work on sort of trying to find the right balance between Petrobras sort of driven or government-driven exploration and production and private sector driven. The resource constraints of budgets, I think, may compel some people who would like to do a lot of this on their own to do it in partnership. I read the other day that Petrobras had, I think, canceled or at least postponed the contracts on 5 new offshore rigs. I think that was completely based upon sort of prioritizing resources and what do they have the resources to spend or money to spend on now versus later on. But that's something that's going to continue to be a factor in the equation. Now, I've talked exclusively about carbon, and yet there's no question but that carbon and climate change are a major part of the future of energy development, and so renewable energy has to be an integral part of all this. And it has to be a part not just on the margins, but in a significant way, wherever it's possible and wherever it can be done at an affordable price. So I think the fact that you have a number of countries throughout the Americas that have large hydro capability, others that have biomass capability, the Brazilians particularly with bagasse. I think the development of solar and wind and the fact that solar panels prices have fallen by, one estimate I saw was 60% over the last year, is going to make solar panels significantly more affordable and perhaps represents a great option in terms of off-grid power in smaller villages around many of these parts, and particularly in some of the larger countries where it's harder to get the grid to the community. In terms of the issues related to fracking and the kind of newfound capability of the development of oil and gas, I would say that they are real, but they're manageable. For instance, the danger of somehow hydraulic fracturing chemicals migrating or making their way into the water table are minimal, particularly when you operate correctly. As an oil and gas exploration company, we always know and always have to file in advance of getting a permit to drill a well where surface water is, and we use surface casing and different techniques to make sure that we've protected the surface water from downhole activity. So that's a manageable risk. I think another that people worry about is water use. Here again, the industry is focused very intently on not only trying to reduce water use, but also find alternative fluids that may be used in the fracturing process. And I'm confident that there's enough work on this being done, much of it around universities and some of the major oil companies, that advances will be made. We will get progressively better at managing the water impact of fracturing around the world. Third issue of concern is air impact of surface equipment. There was one report that came out that has been subsequently rebutted, I think, frontally, which suggested that vented methane or leaked methane represented a huge climate change risk. It would if, in fact, it was happening. The study that was published grossly misrepresented and inaccurately portrayed the amount of methane gas that escapes at the surface or is somehow allowed to escape. The answer to that from the first time somebody mentioned that was, this is a monetizable asset. In other words, gas coming out of a well is something you can sell. Why would you waste it? Why would you allow it to escape? And in fact, the industry doesn't generally allow it to escape, except in small quantities or through flaring. So there's a recent MIT study that just was published in the last three or 4 days, which I would invite you to take a look at, which takes on the Cornell study, which made this, I think, gross misrepresentation in terms of the amount of gas being vented or escaping. So finally, I'd say that we have challenges, but we have obvious opportunities. And in terms of the Americas, the opportunities that I see are for cooperation and collaboration among states, and I don't mean united, but I mean among nation states, perhaps at a level that we haven't seen in quite some time. There needs to be cooperation in terms of access to markets, and perhaps this serves as a foundation for more aggressive and detailed trade agreements. There needs to be a sharing of knowledge, and here again, this could be from industry and universities with governments across borders, and sharing of knowledge, not just about the latest and best and safest and most responsible ways to develop hydrocarbons, but also what are the best and most affordable ways to develop alternative energy and how we can do that. And then infrastructure. I mean, I haven't mentioned the Keystone Pipeline, but you know, that's kind of one of those fundamental things that just makes sense, and I'm hoping the United States will grant the permit for the full extent of the Keystone Pipeline. But there's opportunity for regional infrastructure sharing, not just U.S.-Mexico, but on south, which definitely has to be looked into and should be invested in. And identifying where public sector institutions play a role versus private sector. When I was at OPIC and we were financing companies that were doing infrastructure investments, I was always very interested and intent on making sure that there was a clear appreciation of what are private sector companies willing to invest in versus what is it that the public sector might do to enable development. So for instance, I was always more interested in supporting electric power generation and the financing of those plants than I was in transmission lines. And that's the kind of, that's the kind of distinction between public sector and private sector, which is so useful. So I think we've got great opportunities. I think the developments of the last 10 years have transformed not just the economics of energy in the world, and in particular the Americas, but the politics, and I think it can be a great, great benefit to people throughout the world. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Rob. That was a great start to the morning. Put a lot of issues out there and did so from the perspective not just of the policymaker, but also the practitioner, so a real dose of pragmatism there, so appreciate that very much. And now as the panel comes to continue the program, let me introduce our moderator who will conduct the panel and run the program from here. We're particularly pleased that we have with us one of the most capable energy observers in Washington to introduce and moderate our panel discussion. Coral Davenport is the energy and environmental correspondent with the National Journal. And all of you who read the National Journal, and I hope that is all of you, know that it's a true insider's guide to Washington. National Journal is basically the guidebook to understanding national politics every week. And Coral leads their efforts on the intersection of political, diplomatic, business, and civil society interaction on energy and environmental issues. So she has a really cool job. That's a technical term, Coral, cool. She has over a decade of journalism experience, having worked previously at Politico, the Christian Science Monitor, USA Today, and others. And as a foreign correspondent, she covered, among other things, the 2004 Summer Olympic Games in Athens, so she really knows how to pick her cool jobs. And she's also written numerous guidebooks for travelers. So we're in for a very insightful and enjoyable conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to please join me in welcoming Coral.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Eric. There is so much going on right now. There is so much transformation with the picture of energy in the Americas. A decade ago, as Robert said, it looked like oil and gas and energy production in the Americas were probably on the decline. Now we've seen this full transformation, new reports, new information, with potential major changes in economic, political, geopolitical, environmental, all these impacts. And so I'd love to just get down to it and start digging in. Our panel here is, starting from my left, Keisuke Sadamori, Director for Energy Markets at the International Energy Agency. Neil Parsan, Ambassador of Trinidad and Tobago to the United States, and Leandro Alves, Head of Energy for the Inter-American Development Bank. Gentlemen, if you'd like to start with your opening remarks.
From me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Keisuke Sadamori, and I'm the Director of the Energy Markets and Security at the IEA. Maybe you might feel that it might be the EIA, which is the part of the Department of Energy, but we are the IEA, International Energy Agency. And we're often called the advanced economies energy watchdog, and in particular in the various newspapers. And actually, that's one of our jobs. And also, we are responsible for emergency preparedness, like stockpiles or the coordinated actions in case of physical disruption in the oil market. And let me do a little bit of a sales pitch. So this is what we do. This is what we call the oil market report, and this is monthly. And also, there is a midterm oil market report. That's kind of annual, and we make a kind of a projections toward the, in this case, from 2011 to 2017. So it's about a 5-year term. Now, because I'm in charge of the kind of global energy matters, so I think I would like to start with the global context of the oil market toward the 2017, which is written in this midterm oil market report. And the overall picture in this book is a kind of a more comfortable market ahead with lower demand growth and robust supply. And let me start with the demand. With the weaker macroeconomic situation, as shown in the IMF outlook in October, we project that the oil demand will increase by 1.1 MBD, million barrels per day, in the coming 5 years. So that's rising from the 89 million barrel per day in 2011 to 95.7 MBD in 2017. And this growth is led by non-OECD countries, non-IEA member countries. Non-OECD demand is expected to overtake the OECD demand by 2014. And this leads to the increasing concern over the effectiveness of the IEA's coordinated action against the physical oil supply disruption. And so that's the reason why we are working hard to enhance the cooperation and coordination with the major emerging economies, non-member countries like China or India. So that's the demand. And supply, the supply capacity growth comes mostly from North America, as pointed out by Mr. Mosbacher. And in OPEC, Iraq will lead the capacity growth. That's one of the major findings by the World Energy Outlook of this year, released last month, and that's one of the another flagship publication of our IEA. Global supply capacity will expand by 9.3 million barrels per day from 2011 to 2017 to the 102 MBD in 2017. And the almost half of the growth comes from North American tight oil and the Canadian oil sands. And 20% is from Iraq. And also we expect substantial growth from the deep water production by Brazil. So that's the overall supply picture. And the other element is the refinery industries, refinery investments. And we will continue to see the consolidation of the refinery industries, facilities in OECD countries, in Europe in particular. And on the other hand, we'll see a kind of a very drastic growth in the capacity in Middle East and also Asia, mostly China, growing. And those refinery investments in those Middle East and Asia will grow a lot faster than the demand growth. So that leads to the kind of what we often call the new global oil map. And that's something kind of a very split to the Western Hemisphere with getting closer to the self-sufficiency, very inactive trade, while on the other hand, we'll see the east of Suez regions with very active growth, not only crude, but also the long-haul product trade. So these changes will have a certain amount of energy security implications. And so one, as I pointed out at first, how we can secure the cooperation and coordination with the emerging economies, the non-IEA member countries. So that's the first point. And second is whether the current stockpiling structure is appropriate in terms of composition, crude versus product, and also the location. And third, we are experiencing we are seeing the increasing vulnerability in mid to downstream. That's logistics and supply, and that was quite obvious in the most recent case of Hurricane Sandy. And also, my home country, Japan, also experienced the big earthquake, and the access to those products was a serious problem. And crude, we tried to release the crude stocks, but that didn't help, and at least that was not able to catch up with the real need of the people. So that's about the oil, which is the kind of major focus of the IEA. But also, we also deal with the other fuels, like gas, coal, and renewables. I don't have much time, but gas, that's another hot topic here in the United States, obviously. And this shale gas revolution is not only about the United States. But for instance, if you take a look at Europe, we are seeing what we call the golden age of coal in Europe. So those are the coals, cheaper coal, driven out of the North America, is exported to the Europe, and they're seeing the kind of a very increasing share of the power generation in Europe. And by the way, so the gas generation facilities are somewhat kind of squeezed by this cheaper coal and also by the subsidized renewables. So that's a kind of very huge implications. And also in Asia, we're talking about the kind of enormous divergence of prices. Cheaper, compared with the North America, our gas prices are extremely high, and that's mostly due to the oil indexing. So there's also a very active discussions here in Asia as well. And as for the gas, we are interested in the increasing use of the natural gas in transport here in the United States. CNG gases, and also you're even talking about the LNG trains. So we would like to cover that item as well in the midterm gas market report in 2013, which will be coming out in June. And it's not only about the oil and gas, but coal. That's very big fuel, actually. And we have to keep in mind that if we compare those various sources, the coal is increasing most among the fossil fuels. And now, as we are speaking, almost 500,000 tons of coal demand is increasing every day, not the annual. So that's about the fossil fuels. And we're also seeing a lot of renewables here in this region. Obviously, the Western Hemisphere has a lot of hydro resources, and we released the hydro technology roadmap together with the Brazilian government. And the Canada has a lot of hydro resources as well. And a lot of effort is going on with respect to the solar panels and also the wind. So we have a lot to talk about, but I guess I have no time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ambassador.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Moderator, thank you. And Keynote, some wonderful points, and I learned a lot by sitting there for a few moments. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the ambassador of Trinidad and Tobago to the United States, Mexico, as well as the Organization of American States. And let me express my pleasure in being here. And I will focus my discussions really on the Caribbean and touch on Central America with a focus clearly on my own country, Trinidad and Tobago. And as a lot of you may know, we are one of the major gas producers in the region. So I will tend to focus a bit on gas. As a point of interest in Central America and the Caribbean, oil still provides about 90% of the primary energy needs of our region, which for Central America and the Caribbean is actually 1/3 higher than that of Latin America and the Caribbean, and about half higher than the overall global average in terms of oil providing energy needs. However, most of the islands of the Caribbean being very small, they are predominantly net importers of energy, oil in particular, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, the mainstay of these islands are generally agriculture, natural resource extraction, bauxite in many instances, as well as tourism. Trinidad and Tobago, we contain the majority of the Caribbean's oil production, with most of our current production coming from offshore, and we have just recently delved into deep water where we will be sinking about 19 wells in 2013. Of interest, Barbados, Cuba, and Mexico, as far as the Caribbean and Central America goes, are also producers of energy. But many of the Caribbean islands actually import oil from Mexico and Venezuela under some fairly favorable terms, one being the San Jose Pact. Latin America and the Caribbean of interest are fairly rich in energy resources, including hydrocarbons, hydroelectricity, and biofuels. However, the wealth of these resources are somewhat unevenly distributed. But it's a fact that this region leads the world in renewable energy exploitation and exploration in the form of geothermal, hydroelectricity, and in many instances, biomass, biofuels. It may be of startling to note in 2007, 59% of Latin America and the Caribbean's energy input actually came, total power generation actually came from renewable energy. For example, in Argentina, I think we are clearly aware of the wind production capacity there. Brazil, as mentioned, with biomass and hydroelectricity, and geothermal in certain countries of in Central America, notably Belize. Right there in the Caribbean, we have St. Kitts and Nevis, two very small islands who have been able to harness quite a bit of geothermal energy, as well as Dominica, one of the more eco-friendly islands of the Caribbean for ecotourism, harnessing quite a bit of geothermal energy. About 65% of the electricity produced in about 6 countries in Central America actually come from renewable sources. Again, sugarcane, wind, hydroelectricity, as well as geothermal. 6 countries in South America. We also believe that within the Central America Caribbean sphere, if we are able to increase by about 10% our total production coming from renewable energy, it represents about 1% of our region's GDP. And Nicaragua and Jamaica, interestingly, are 2 countries in such a position to really capitalize on that opportunity by actually enhancing the energy portfolio. For the Caribbean and Central America, however, as it stands today, from a monetary standpoint, there are little viable options except use of oil because of capitalization costs and other costs. And the islands are simply too small to employ nuclear technology as a source of energy. We can reduce our dependency on oil, however, and shield ourselves from the volatility of high prices in oil if we use a combination of renewable energy, energy-efficient programs, as well as embark on a regional energy integration program, which to an extent has already started. The major factors affecting our region, Central America and the Caribbean's energy development, and I would list them for you. Clearly, a rapidly changing international environment. WTO liberalization has affected us. The loss of preferential markets for developed countries' commodities, especially agriculture, because that in turn affects revenue generation, which in turn affects capitalization opportunities. Reduced inflows of development funds from developed countries to our smaller territories. It has almost had a crippling effect on some very small islands. Regional political initiatives have also played a part. And I speak of Petrocarib, which was a Venezuelan initiative with some of the Caribbean islands. Trinidad and Tobago, we embarked on an energy plan for CARICOM. CARICOM is a regional space that represents 14 member states of our region, the 15th being the Dominican Republic, as well as a task force for energy, regional energy policy. As far as Trinidad and Tobago is concerned, we have embarked on the bulk production of electricity with sales to Grenada and St. Vincent. We actually have run underwater pipelines for distribution to these islands, which are about 45 minutes by plane away from Trinidad and Tobago. We also supply natural gas by pipeline to Barbados and the French West Indies, and we are embarking upon a project to spread that network north of the Caribbean to cover some of the other eastern Caribbean states. Petrocarib, which I mentioned, is actually a Venezuelan initiative that involves payment arrangements, not necessarily discounts on energy for most of the Caribbean islands. And I would tell you, a lot of the Caribbean islands have taken up this offer from Venezuela, and they are getting their energy supplies from Venezuela, from the mainland, through this initiative. And that arrangement goes so far as to include investment capital funds for infrastructure development. Natural gas, it's our belief that natural gas is to the 21st century as what oil was to the 20th century and what coal was to the 19th century. And the reason my country believes it is because we have actually evolved from an oil-based economy to a gas-based economy over time. In fact, in 2005, 89% of our natural gas supply was being used to supply the eastern seaboard of the United States. As at today, that figure has fallen just about 20%, and we'll be able to diversify our sales of our natural gas to non-traditional markets, such as Kuwait. We actually export gas to China, India, Brazil, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Puerto Rico right next door, and quite a bit to Chile recently. According to the BP's statistical review, Qatar is number one as far as natural gas is concerned, followed by Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, Nigeria, and we are actually sixth, which is not bad for an island 2,000 square miles with just 1.3 million people. We actually pride ourselves from an Atlantic LNG trade point of view, we pride ourselves in letting the LNG Genie out of the bottle, as it were. And our first greenfield plant started in 1999, and as of today, we have 3 trains and with a production of over 15 million tons per annum. I would also tell you, as a result of that, we have become the world's net number 1 exporter of ammonia and methanol, and the world's number 2 exporter of urea as a result of being able to use downstreaming in our natural gas production and our entire system. As far as advances in technologies go, I know that was one of the trends that came up here and the topic of discussion. We believe, especially from a natural gas standpoint, and given the advances in horizontal drilling and fracking, as we have seen, these were able to actually harness a number of reserves, for example, in Australia, which has really begun to affect the Atlantic trade of LNG as we saw it. We also have been seeing, in terms of trending, a great deal, and it was mentioned earlier, in terms of transferring of technologies, drilling expertise, and we also believe in time to come that will foster an environment of greater M&As, mergers and acquisitions, in this particular field of industry. With these technologies, we have also been seeing, it was also mentioned, lowering of overall cost, for example, with PV cell production. And that has been affecting us because it has forced us as a country to really look at international standards with these now competing costs to also lift our own game and aspire towards these international standards in other areas. In fact, given the trends in lowering cost, we have actually been able to begin to use, we're in the Caribbean, right on the equator. So we feel that actually incorporating aspects of solar energy onto our grid, also wind, being a small island, we have actually started that project and been experimenting and powering small communities, schools, for example. And it's a trend that we hope to see develop in the Caribbean as time permits us to do so. An interesting trend for us as well is the Panama Canal. Upon completion of that canal in 2014, early 2015, we feel it represents a rerouting of overall movements of cargo. In fact, countries like Qatar, Oman, we believe will now engage in the Atlantic side of trade. It gives us an opportunity as well, using the canal. Right now we export a fair amount of gas to Chile, and we are forced to go all the way around South America to deposit our goods in Chile. The expansion of that canal represents an opportunity for Trinidad and Tobago to also engage in the Pacific LNG trade. And we are ramping up ourselves for that purpose. We also believe in, as trending continues, it was mentioned by the keynote speaker, very accurately so, the trend will be built on a platform of cooperation, government to government, government to institution, institution to private sector. In fact, I am proud to tell you, Trinidad and Tobago, we took the initiative based on those trends. And on October 25th this year, we inaugurated the very first Global Gas Council. We have the Gas Exporters Forum, we have other forums for gas, but we're able to pull together 30 countries right here in Washington, D.C., to engage in an active conversation on a biannual basis on the issue of gas. So Trinidad and Tobago I'm the first chairman of that council. Qatar, Oman, Lithuania, Angola, several other countries are part of that council. Now, surely as stakeholders all in this room, you're more than welcome to engage with us and see how we can actually use this as a platform for discussion to discuss these issues vis-a-vis trends and emerging issues in energy as it pertains specifically to gas. To sort of close up, as a trend, we believe the Americas will continue to be the major growth pool for the global economy. And these trends towards, especially with shale and others, I'll not repeat the points in the direction of that trend. And we support that approach in appreciating the value of these trends. Of interest to us as well, in terms of potential reforms in the hemisphere, we spoke of the kind of Panama Canal expansion. A clear platform for reform would also be based on the United States' net ability to become net exporters of energy in the form of gas. And lastly, I would like to repeat this point. There's a great potential of energy coming from the Guyana Basin, just south of Trinidad and Tobago, between Guyana and Suriname. And there's an estimated 15 billion barrels to be discovered between Guyana and Suriname. And I think that factor must be part of the equation in balancing the overall hemispheric framework for energy. Madam Moderator, I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Leandro.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll be brief just so we have more dialogue. And I'm thinking, what are the major trends and also the game changers? So there's actually four things that come to mind. The first was mentioned many times by our keynote speaker, which is shale gas. That is a game changer without a doubt. Certainly the U.S. Will be the biggest player. Argentina, depending on the future policies of Argentina, could be a very strong player. But that starts putting into the context of how shale gas can go into not only the electricity side, but also the transportation side. And it has to do with investment in infrastructure. Everybody keeps talking about investment. I think investment in infrastructure is very key to get the shale gas, both in both those sectors, transportation and also electricity. The second point that I just want to brief on is technology changes. I'm going to mention wind in particular, but in the pricing. And the wonderful thing about energy is that the pricing dictate everything. It's all economics. So the lower pricing dictate the type of energy and technologies that will be used. The third I want to talk about a little bit is climate change. They have the Doha rounds currently, and that's overarching issue will continue to be prevalent. And last, regional integration, and what we think the Americas are doing in regional integration. I think one of the key benefits, and every time we travel throughout the world, we see what does Latin America or the Americas in general have to contribute to the world in the energy side. And there's two things. One is the Americas have a relatively low population, and they have an abundant amount of natural endowments. That's the key. So, and if you see most of the countries in Latin America, and hopefully very soon the US, in terms of exporting gas, most of those countries are net exporters of either hydrocarbons, or which is the petroleum, gas, and coal, but also they're the exporters of mining. Most of the mining is coming from this region. And the most influential price commodity in mining is energy. So you have those two very closely linked, and we're not talking about the energy sector, we're talking about countries' GDPs and how the GDP grows. So those are the main characteristics, and if you look at, for instance, Vale, which is one of the biggest producers of iron ore, 85% of its sales are going to China today. So there's been a shift between the production facilities, between the Americas, having those natural endowments going into overseas markets, particularly Asia, and China and India, and more specifically. So on the shale gas and gas in general, it is a big game changer And where do we see competing interests? It was mentioned coal, and coal keeps growing. Coal will actually dominate if there's not a gas market there. So if we look at Central America, and which there is no gas market in Central America as of yet, once coal facilities come in and start being planted in Central America, and currently there's actually coal facilities as efficient as natural gas facilities. Now, I visited in Japan actually last month, a coal facility that was a 42% efficiency. And if you look at the reduction in emissions and NOx and SOx and so forth and so on, they're just as competitive, and the difference is price. The coal price is a very stable commodity. And the gas price, there's been a decoupling from gas to petroleum products, but there's also currently, because of the demand in Asia, there's been a huge difference between the LNG price and what we call the well spot price of gas. And eventually that margin is going to shrink. But currently, if you look at the $13 to $16 per million BTU going into the LNG market, while you look at the gas de pozo, which is the well gas, is anywhere from $3 to $6 a barrel, million BTU, excuse me. So that technology will eventually emerge. And one of the things we're doing at IDB is looking at countries that don't have the natural endowments and looking which type of gas is more economical. Do they put in small LNG facilities, or do we put in CNG either through pipeline or CNG freights to get the gas there? And eventually, I think the natural gas price of CNG will go up and the LNG price will come back down. In terms of technology innovation, and particularly the alternative energy, which eventually will not be alternative, will be the mainstream, we see the huge production in wind turbines. And since 2006 till today, there's been almost an 80% reduction in cost. The wind turbines manufacturers today they have 9 manufacturers in Brazil because they take advantage of BNDES financing. And this happened last August. There was 2 auctions, one in Brazil and one in Uruguay, which the wind came in lower than the thermals. And that was the first time, and no subsidies, because Brazil has a T+3, then T+6 in terms of when the energy comes on board, and typically the thermals would always go in. Yeah, sure, there's a logistical issue there with gas coming in from Bolivia or LNG costs going high, so there are some imbalances in the market, but this is a game changer. When wind comes in lower on the PPA price in the auction than gas, it can only get better. And that partially was because of the dry out wind production in the Europe because of the financial crisis, the reduction in the subsidy tariff in the United States, which is coming on board next year. So they're trying to shift where's the other markets. And the clear markets is where's the energy price a little higher, that wind can be competitive. And both Brazil and Uruguay came in below gas, and we think that this is here to stay. You look at that, Brazil right now has 1 gig of wind energy that has been produced in the last 4 years, and they have about anywhere from 10 to 16 gigs of available resources. So that market will continue to expand. And the difference between the gas or petroleum or coal is the input price. If you look at most of the renewables, both solar, wind, eventually wave, hydro, the upfront cost of those is 85, 90% of the cost of the project. But once they're built, everything else is relatively free. I mean, the O&M costs are relatively small. So those technologies, as the price goes down, as investment goes into those capital assets will always undercut fossil fuels because fossil fuels have to have a cost for operation maintenance. And that's where we're seeing the shift in the game changer. Climate change. The Doha rounds are going on now. We're not sure what the conclusions are, but certainly climate change is here to stay. If a Kyoto 2 treaty has not been agreed or will not be agreed to in the near term, countries within themselves will be pressured by not only environmentalists, but just general population, that climate change is an issue, and those will obviously impact the hydrocarbon sector and will, at minimum, put a small and a negligible tax, but eventually will go up. Last but not least is regional integration. And I think everybody has been discussing regional integration. Energy is probably one of the key, fundamental, wonderful vehicles for integrating regions and politics. Everybody has a different ideology, but energy, because it's so born down to economics, It makes sense. Right now, there's already transmission lines that go between Venezuela and Colombia. There's already transmission lines between Colombia and Ecuador. So there's always between Ecuador and Peru. There's already transmission lines going through those. CPAC, as was mentioned in Central America, there's transmission lines going from Mexico all the way down to Panama. So those type of systems enable and require the governments to speak with each other and private companies to come in and see how can they benefit. We at IDB are now launching with the 5 countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, what would be a SENEA, which would be a transmission line goes all the way from Colombia to Chile and vice versa, where there's a lot of hydroelectric potential, and those energies will come in at a lower cost compared to other countries that have least hydroelectric potential, which tend to be the least source of energy generation today. So those are the type of things that we see coming in on board, and where are the bottlenecks, and this is particularly for governments, is the exploitation of resource corridors. That's what we need to focus on as governments in order for private sector investment to come in and become more efficient. These are all international traded commodities. So as we come in, and as the World Bank, the IDB, CAF, all the multilaterals, and the governments themselves start making those resource corridors more economical for the private sector to come in, they become more competitive in the world market. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much. Everyone has talked about the impact of the shale gale in the United States. How does that translate into what we see going on in Latin America? There are conversations going on about technology, about fracking. There are new shale gas resources being discovered. How does what we see going on in the U.S., how do we see that translated? What's the impact of that in Latin America? Jump in.
I think 2 aspects. One is the technology transfer. Certainly the U.S. has been leading the technology of shale gas extraction. And the resources, we know the resources are in Latin America, particularly Argentina. The question is the regulatory regimes and to enable the regulatory regimes to make those commodities attractive enough for exploration to take place. So I think we're not there yet. I think the U.S. will clearly take the lead role in this and will continue to lead. But this is not a new kind of new technology per se. It's been really perfected and made it economical. I think all the comments and the hurdles that were mentioned by our keynote speaker are very true, but those are hurdles all mitigable and can be overcome. And that's why we think that shale gas in particular is a game changer in Latin America, particularly in the southern cone of the hemisphere.
So there's potential for something like a shale gale as well in Latin America if the technology transfer happens, if it sounds like, I mean, a lot of sort of what slows it down are governments, are political obstacles?
It's regulatory reform. That's the key. If everybody always talks about markets and energy. Energy is really a regulated market. There is no technically free market per se because everything has a certain cost and certain regulations. Sometimes they regulate it through the environmental aspects. Sometimes they regulate it through the price controls. Sometimes they regulate it through exploitation of certain areas for rights. But there's regulations everywhere we look. And the regulatory aspects of the countries to enable a conducive environment, as we mentioned, Colombia. Colombia has done wonders to bring their hydrocarbon sector to 21st century. The other countries are still working on that, and that's the proposal that has to come in mind.
Resource nationalism is kind of a hallmark of oil development in particular in Latin America. As Robert mentioned, the incoming Mexican president, Peña Nieto, has said that he will liberalize Pemex, the Mexican state oil company. How likely is that? What is the impact of that? Does that have a broader impact on kind of resource nationalism throughout Latin America? Where are the trends going in terms of that?
Well, I may not be able to speak for Mexico specifically, but surely Trinidad
Broadly.
and Tobago. We have also experienced that idea of resource nationalism, but likewise with other governments. Several governments have actually approached our country, for example, Ghana. We have been dealing quite a bit with Uganda and other countries on the continent who are also interested in harnessing their own resources. And it has led to this concept of resource nationalism, but it has led also to the phenomenon of transatlantic cooperation. And it has actually been able to template some interesting models of cooperation as far as harnessing those resources from a nationalistic point of view, but being forced to cooperate with other governments to create that model of cooperation.
One of the biggest changes in global energy markets right now is that throughout the 20th century, the United States was really the biggest consumer of energy. And now those markets are changing. We're seeing that the biggest demand is coming from Asia, the biggest demand is coming from China. Keisuke, if you could address this, if we see this shift in markets, if we see this shift in demand from China, and we see this interest from the Chinese in investing, especially in the Americas, what does that do? How does that change trend lines?
Well, obviously, the center of demand growth is changing. The China and India, they are the kind of a big absorber of global energy. And there's a kind of a dispute or the controversy over the Chinese investment into right now Canada. And maybe they must be interested in investing in this North American region and bring back those resources back to their home country. So coming back to the resource nationalism, I do understand that all countries would have some certain level of nationalistic emotion or the feeling about their own country's resources, which is under the ground. But at the same time, it's really important to use or exploit the resources wisely. So in that respect, we need to make sure that the real economies really work for exploiting those natural resources, and so the better investment environment, that's the key to whatever in those regions.
And can you also speak, though, as well, just to the role that China is going to play within investment in terms of energy development in the Americas, throughout North America, throughout Latin America? What's China doing?
Well, China is obviously investing a lot. It's not only the U.S. but also in African countries, especially for those regions that the other advanced economies don't go. They can be there and engage in a quite active investment in the natural resources sectors. So, yeah, they are big players, but our concern is well, of course, it's fine. It's the Chinese money, so they can go ahead wherever they want to go. But I guess that the most of the concern is they are kind of owned by the states. So we're not sure whether their motivation is purely economical. So I think that that's the more of the concern. So we need to see better kind of transparency in the country. And we hope that the Chinese money, well, that's precious, and that should be used to provide the energy resources to globally. But we like to see that the kind of more of a kind of transparent structure in the Chinese economy. So that's one concern.
Cuba is anxious to expand its own energy resources. We're seeing that Repsol, the Spanish company, is doing exploratory drilling off the coast of Cuba. Cuba right now gets about half its oil from Venezuela. What if these wells do strike oil? If Cuba is able to start a domestic oil drilling industry, what are the impacts of that?
Well, from a Caribbean point of view, let me, because that's a neatly packaged political question to a diplomat, but first of all, there is a relationship between Venezuela and Cuba, as you know, in terms of energy exchanges, and Venezuela and the rest of the Caribbean. In fact, of interest to the audience is that we actually share over 10 trillion cubic feet of gas with Venezuela. We are 7 miles away from the mainland. And CARICOM, which is the economic space of the English-speaking Caribbean, Cuba is included as part of that neighborhood. So I expect if Cuba, if and when they do strike oil, it will favor the supply to the region in terms of energy, because diplomatic economic and other relationships have been established and are very much robust, and I expect it will be a natural progression should that happen. We will be a seamless market for them as far as the other Caribbean islands are concerned, because we are, as far as Trinidad and Tobago is concerned, we are not net importers of energy.
But I'm wondering, if Cuba starts developing its own energy and that reduces its reliance on Venezuela for oil, talk through what the implications of the long-term implications of that might be.
I mean, for the region, and when I say region, I mean Central America, Caribbean region, and let me touch on a couple of probably the North, South American countries. It will represent simply another supply. I don't expect it to compromise in any which way or form any extant relationship that already exists with them, energy or non-energy. It simply represents another tap that can be opened to pour energy into a bucket for others to tap into in the region.
Heading north, there is such a political debate here in the United States about the Keystone Pipeline. And I wonder, that was a huge issue in the presidential campaign. We're looking ahead to 2013 when we expect a decision by the State Department, possibly by the president himself, on whether to approve this. How much does that actually matter? If you look at the big picture of energy supply and energy movement in the Americas, how big a deal is Keystone?
So maybe I'll touch from a technological point of view. As I mentioned, I think the resource corridors are the viable solutions to getting, and then in fact the bottlenecks to get the resources from the ground, and not only hydrocarbons but also renewables. If you look at some of the concerns that are in South America for large hydros, part of it is the hydro itself and the area it emanates, but the other part is the transmission lines that they have to go through protected areas or a certain pristine wilderness in order to get to the consumption center. So I think the logistical aspects of energy are crucial. And as was mentioned by my colleague, for the Panama Canal, that opens up a lot more space in terms of trade. The Keystone Pipeline is no different. It's a logistical maneuver where it actually brings Canadian hydrocarbons into other markets. So certainly from a technological point of view and from an economic point of view, it makes sense. We are looking at a lot of our views is how to get hydrocarbons throughout the region, and we deal with Mexico down instead of the United States and Canada, but how to get those countries that produce the hydrocarbons into the other countries that consume it, and in a much more efficient way. So I think that's the key. Anytime you increase efficiency, assuming we can mitigate the environmental concerns, anytime you increase efficiency on the transport and logistical side, it's a good thing for all, including the general hemispheric aspects.
You have a guess? Do you want to
No.
wager which way you think it's going to go?
No.
On the decision? If the president or if the State Department decides against approving Keystone, what's the impact?
Well, I think from the Canadian side is they have to look at alternatives, and the alternatives, the clear alternative would be, going to the sea. So certainly, I think there are alternatives. Canada is not a landlocked country, but it's just a question of cost and benefit. So I think it's an economic question more than a political question.
Something that a couple of you touched on is climate. The Doha talks are going on right now. There's this boom throughout the Americas of carbon-based energy. At the same time, even if these Doha talks are successful, we don't expect to see a treaty until 2015. We don't expect to see action on, global action on this until 2020. How is what is going on? How are the changes in, energy production in the Americas playing into the bigger concern about climate change? And Ambassador, I'm especially interested in your views coming from an island nation.
Well, it's a fair question to us because we have been arguably, we are heavily industrialized as a country. And when you look at the overall tax crediting system, the denominator for us is very large because we are so industrialized. I'm coming from a small island, so it's an issue that we take to heart. But it's my respectful view that the only way to really treat properly climate change, especially coming out of Doha, would be to really look at the taxation side, both on production as well as consumption, because it may not necessarily incentivize advances in technology for clean energy. If on one hand I am protecting I'm gaining carbon credits because I'm lowering my overall emissions into the environment, but then I'm taking from, I'm consuming goods and services from countries that are not necessarily on par with what I'm having. Secondly, I think countries, including our own good selves, would have to look very much at our energy mix and the overall net effect of our energy mix towards positive climate change initiatives. And it may have to be a stick and carrot, a stick, the carrot of subsidies versus the stick of taxation.
Yeah. One point is that the United States is the country who succeeded in reducing the CO2 emission recently. And as you know, that's coming from the gas, because you simply replace the coal with gas, and that's led to the decreased emission of the CO2. So I think this is up to how you evaluate this success. Those are environmental, very green people, argue against this, while on the other hand, those energy people who praise this. So it's up to the evaluation. But also, as you pointed out, we are seeing the kind of almost lifting off of the renewables in various sectors. And actually, in Europe, for instance, the renewables, even though they have been subsidized, but now they don't need many of the renewable sites, they don't need the subsidies anymore. So that means that that has a huge impact on the electricity sector. And they are even worried about whether they can invest on the new gas power generation sector. So that's causing another problem. So my point is that, first, the gas so far succeeded in reducing the CO2 emissions. Second, you are seeing the kind of a lifting off the renewables. And also, third point is that the energy efficiency. And right now, the US is working very hard on the energy efficiency, and that's something commendable. And I think that we should explore further, because the energy efficiency, that's a kind of a hidden fuel.
I'd like to open up to the audience for questions. If you have a question, if you could actually come to the microphone and just say your name.
Good morning. My name is Tom O'Keefe. I'm from Mercosur Consulting Group and Stanford University. About 2.5 years ago, I distinctly remember being in this hall for the launch of the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA. And we had Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on one end, Secretary of Energy Steve Chu on the other, which I guess in and of itself was an accomplishment. But since then, you don't hear about ECPA at all. In fact, it was never even mentioned once in the sixth Summit of the Americas that we just had this past spring in Cartagena. So the question I have is, where is the United States government, the Obama administration in particular, in terms of trying to facilitate all this technology transfer that's going to be required to make a lot of these things that are going on in terms of energy in the hemisphere a reality, helping to support, whether politically or financially, efforts at integrating energy markets in the Western Hemisphere. Where's the United States? I mean, it seems it's, since this launch of the ECPA 2.5 years ago, it just seems to be out of the picture.
So maybe I'll address that question. In fact, I think the United States has been playing, and since that event, which was hosted here in the OAS, the United States has been playing a key role in fostering the whole concept of renewable and collaboration between the regions. There's been a ECPA clearinghouse, which is I think the OAS is hosting, which has all the different advances that the region has done. And ECPA, I think when the United States came up with the concept of ECPA, it is really a regional issue. It's not a United States issue, it's a regional hemispheric issue. And all the countries have obtained certain pillars of ECPA, where one will do energy efficiency, the other one's doing heavy fuel oils, the other one's doing renewable and non-conventional. And the United States has been actually one of the leading forces in the dialogue, particularly in the policy dialogue, to get those products into fruition. We have been working very close, the IDB has been working very close with the US government in not only promoting and continuing to foster ECPA, but there's also the interconnections that I mentioned that go from Colombia to Chile, the Arco Norte, which is Brazil, Suriname, French Guiana, and Guyana, looking at the viability of connecting the Caribbean countries through geothermal in Dominica and St. Nevis and St. Kitts. All those have been strong, strong pushes by the US administration in order to foster collaboration and particularly on alternative energy resources.
I am working as a consultant here at the bank. 10 years ago, many people were pessimistic about the energy forecasts. Nobody would have said that the most of the demand was going to come from Asia, that all this supply of shale, oil and gas possibilities. On the contrary, many were saying that the hover peak had been achieved in many fields, and the forecast was quite grim, quite pessimistic. And now we are in a position of very optimistic about the world. But does it mean that it's very difficult to make long-term forecasts for energy, that maybe we need to be more cautious on the energy sector, that maybe are risks on the future that we are not forecasting now? I mean, shouldn't we be looking at history and trying to be more cautious on this side? This is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant question, and it's really hard. It's really hard to forecast, especially in the long term, because I don't think that there are many people who expected this situation in North America, for instance, 10 years ago. And so some say that forecasting the energy demand and supply is a kind of not a science, more like an art. And so I think you're right. And also, yeah, maybe history may teach us something, but what we are seeing is a kind of unpredictable, explosive development of technologies. And so all we can do is try to catch up with what's going on in terms of the technology developments and changes in the economic environment. So yeah, that's a kind of very difficult business.
Just one comment on that. It's projected that Latin America and the Caribbean will need approximately $55 billion per year in investments in the energy sector as a whole. That type of requirement and investment really draws the innovation. I think we've seen it in the petroleum side, we've seen it in the shale gas, we've seen it in the coal technology for clean coal, we've seen it in the wind, the solar, and so forth and so on. So that's what's driving the industry. If you look at Latin America, you have about 500 million people which are now going from typically what we consider poor to middle class. And the first thing that happens when you become middle class status is you consume a lot more energy, sometimes 3 times more energy than you were at the poor level. Although the Latin America still has a low population, that population is really becoming middle class population, which the energy consumption is driving the investment. So that's why we're seeing this flourishing of new resources worldwide, but in particular, the resource endowments that Latin America has is now being much more prevalent in the playing field.
So Hugo Chavez has been treated for cancer recently, as I'm sure you all know, and so it seems conceivable that there could be a political change in Venezuela's leadership. Without knowing, of course, whether that will happen or not, what might be the short and long-term impacts of a political change in Venezuela hemispherically in terms of energy?
I could probably take a shot at that question. You're correct, albeit Mr. Chavez is back in power. Mr. Chavez has made it known publicly that his equivalent of a successor, his VP, as it were, is Nicolas Maduro, who's currently the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I've interacted with Mr. Maduro on many, many occasions in many, many different environments. And I think the overall approach used by any potential change in representation in Venezuela remains the same. Therefore, I expect the types of engagement to remain the same. In fact, I asked a very similar question when the diplomatic corps had the opportunity, and I'm saying this because it was in the public domain, to meet with the administration of the day. And my question was, this was just before the election, if the incumbent president, before November 6th, should go back into office, and now that we have a confirmation of Chavez back in office, do we expect to see any reposturing of the United States in terms of relationships between the US and Venezuela? And the answer was the relationship would remain the same. And in fact, I suspect the types of engagements that may change a bit between the US and Venezuela specifically would be using the vehicle of multilateralism, such as the OAS, the United Nations, and other like bodies to fortify any sort of engagement that may exist. So to answer your question, it will be an empirical business as usual.
My name is Jason Simmons. I'm with the Cohen Group. We're a Washington, D.C.-based consulting firm funded by the former Secretary of Defense, Bill Cohen. I was wondering if you could all talk about the regulatory environment. You talked about the role of the private sector coming into Latin America to really kind of unlock the key of new technologies. But where do you see trends in terms of the regulatory environment, as well as the role of the private sector to play in terms of building out, developing the framework? Is it more kind of inclusive inside the government, or will there be more of a tap into the private sector, NGOs, multilateral institutions, things like that? Thanks.
So we work a lot with the government. We work with all the 26 governments of Mexico South. And the regulatory environment is the #1 priority for multilateral engagement. We do loans also, but the regulatory environment and the policies of the government take precedence, because that change the on-the-ground circumstances of a country. We think that currently in Latin America, it's all over the map. You have certain countries that have liberalized everything, and when we try to even talk about energy strategy long-term, they say, no, we're market-driven, we don't even want to talk about strategy. And then we have the opposite end where they're nationalizing things and they are re-engaging in the vertical integration of the energy sector within their country. We think that in the past we still have a policy at the IDB of separating generation, distribution, and transmission in order for it to be competitive. I think that policy has had mixed reviews. With the smaller economies, it's very difficult to separate those entities and try to have a competitive market because the overall consumption base is so small. So there needs to be a new strategy. When I mentioned the $55 billion, which by the way, it's an EIA figure, it's not an IDB figure. When I mentioned the $55 billion, that has to come from the private sector. It is virtually impossible for the governments to invest that kind of resource in energy. So we think that even the most staunchest nationalistic countries are looking for alternatives in terms of investment. And we've seen it a lot of times in public speaking, and our goal is for those countries to come in and start making the necessary reforms to make actually on-the-ground changes. Although the public speakings are good because it shows the willingness to make changes, but you really have to make the changes on the ground. And last but not least, on the regulatory reform, it's really financial issues. You have two big issues. You have the country risk issue, which the investors in many countries, because the country risk, will not go into those countries, or if they go, the risk premium is so high that it's not advantageous for the government. Or you have the economics for reducing in terms of inflationary issues and so forth, where they put caps. And we saw what happened in California when they had the cap issues where you had some part of the market unregulated, the other part regulated. It really is not conducive to growth. So I think, to make a long story short, private sector investment is mandatory for development of the sectors. I think natural environment for investment is all the countries see this in one way or another, and maybe that's one of the things that China is such a big player, because the non-investment grade countries for the Western world, China can influence because they will have a direct bilateral relationship with those governments and come in and be able to afford very high investments and very large investments in those countries, particularly energy and natural resources.
I think we have time for one more question.
Evan Ellis, Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, National Defense University. One of the interesting and increasingly important trends that I've seen is the degree to which Chinese banks are underwriting the development of Latin American renewables. You see it, of course, in hydroelectric generation and in places like Ecuador with Coca-Cola Sinclair, with Toachi Peloton, with Sopladora, with others. You see it with respect to the falling prices of wind generation, the important wind generation projects in Chubut. You see it in solar projects in Chile, places like that, which basically seems to leverage the combination of available Chinese capital, the desire for Chinese construction work, and of course, these very strategically important sectors. What do you see as the implication of this advance of essentially a Chinese finance-based model of Latin American renewables development? What are the implications for the Chinese as well as for the sector in the region?
Whatever. Well, yes. I guess it's not only the Latin Americans, but also and China with its unique structure. I mean, we're not sure about the kind of a clear separation between the private financing and the government's policies. They are somewhat quite linked together, and the Chinese government itself has a very ambitious plan for introducing the various renewables and the fossil fuel developments, whatever. I mean, they have a really ambitious plan for whatever the various energy fields. And therefore, so that's somewhat integrated into that kind of a very ambitious the programs for expanding the Chinese financial capital overseas. So, well, overall, I think that should be beneficial for both the recipient side and also the China, obviously trying to find out the necessary technologies or the experiences with respect to the various regions. So I think that's basically a win-win situation. But we need to make sure that that's based on a kind of a sound economy. I mean, we need to see the kind of a very healthy business-to-business competition in various sectors. So I think that's the kind of the needed concern that we need to be careful.
Just following up, I think the Chinese have really recreated the art form of development. They really have a different philosophy, and I think the rest of the world is trying to catch up and seeing how do the same type of developments make things happen. And our biggest hurdle on renewables, non-traditional renewables, is the capital cost. That's the biggest hurdle, because 85% of the cost of wind turbines or solars is the physical equipment, and it's about 15% installed in the local content. So if you can reduce the capital costs, those technologies become much more efficient on non-conventional renewables. And I think the Chinese have taken a very large step in producing that type of modality. If you look at the sovereign wealth funds that are going around the world, most of the sovereign wealth funds are not strategic as the Chinese are. They're strategic for returns on their investment, but they're not strategic on where they're putting their money in terms of how it benefits their own countries. And I think that's slowly changing. I think sovereign wealths are looking, and the countries are looking at sovereign wealth funds as a vehicle to promote, in a certain sense, even export-related activities or import from natural resources, as the Chinese have been doing. So I think certainly it's a win-win for everybody to have lower capital costs, particularly in the non-traditional energy sector, because that forces everybody to reduce their capital costs and compete.
Okay, and on that note, I think we're just coming up on time, maybe a little bit over time. So I think we're all set. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for a great conversation.
Well, now, I also want to thank all of you for joining us this morning for what has been a terrific conversation. I follow these, and Council of the Americas follows these issues very closely, and I learned a lot from each of you. So thank you very much for your expertise, for sharing it with us. I hope you'll come back. This is the beginning of a conversation that will go for a long time. And I also want to thank Coral Davenport for her expertise and for moderating the panel. And if I could ask each of you to join me one more time in thanking our panelists and our moderator.